War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 12, Airpower. When I came back from Afghanistan in 2009, I was frustrated. We had every advantage in the world, and we were still barely holding our own. Our single biggest advantage, air power, was absolutely wasted. We were ponderous and slow. Too late to take advantage of any intelligence. The Air Force aircraft worked for another commander, often in a different time zone. The Air Force's doctrine violated several principles of war: offensive, unity of command, economy of force, surprise, simplicity, objective. They could mass, but with 96 hours of pre-planning, which was far too late. They had all the maneuver you could want, going nowhere. And I found that all the deficiencies of the Air Force doctrine were largely absent when using Army aircraft. So having served for 16 years at that point, I started writing articles on how to do better. Some positive feedback, even from some Air Force officers. But for the majority of what some may call Big Air Force, I was attacked with a ruthlessness the Taliban never would have feared. The attack was never on my combat experience, my recommendations, or my historical examples. Rather, it was all a variation on a theme of, you fail to think strategically. See, air power is strategic, and the infantry can never think strategically. You fail to understand air power because you aren't an Air Force officer. While infuriatingly dismissive, it was accurate. I didn't understand air power. Up until that point in my career, I had no reason to. I trusted the experts. But then, having seen how the experts actually performed in combat, I stopped trusting the experts and embarked upon a several-year, self-guided education in air power. My journey started with a bitter taste in my mouth and a negative attitude. I knew that I would discover the manifest flaws in the theory and doctrine of air power. That air power was a misconceived pipe dream, and that tearing down air power merely required a basic understanding of war and logic. And now, 15 years after my journey started, I find myself an unapologetic acolyte of air power. Air power, real air power. In theory, doctrine, and application, the promises made by those early dreamers have been proven true. In starting from absolute scratch, I only knew one name: Douhet, General Julio Douhet. Douhet was an artilleryman by trade, a fitting start. Long before anyone else, he was actively writing doctrine and theory for the use of aircraft. By 1912, he was commanding the Italian military aviation and wrote their first doctrinal manual. He was the original prophet and true believer of air power. How bad did he want it? He was fired and forced to join the infantry after he bought bombers prior to World War I without authorization. Like Billy Mitchell, but well before Mitchell, he was court-martialed for his criticism of the defense establishment. He was advocating for an air power solution to World War I by 1915, well before his so-called contemporaries, Hugh Trenchard of Great Britain and the aforementioned Billy Mitchell. Unlike Mitchell, he was jailed for his blasphemy for a year, in the midst of a war. He continued to advocate for air power even while imprisoned. He was released and put in charge of Italy's Bureau of Aviation. And by 1921, he published the Bible of air power, The Command of the Air. And here the problem started. Command of the air is only a ways. The ends are air power. The means are aircraft. Allow me to explain very simply. Air power is nothing more than the ability to directly target the strategic and political centers of gravity while bypassing the traditional ground forces. That's it. That's all it means. It's that simple. Douhet understood this, of course, and he listed among probable strategic centers of gravity, industry, transportation networks, themselves simply a subsidiary of industry, communications, the government, and finally, and most critically, the will of the people. So you will hear modern Air Force, and it is absolutely essential to separate the United States Air Force, and frankly, nearly all Air Forces, from air power. They have very little to do with each other at this point. Opine with sage-like nodding of the head and figurative stroking of the beard that air power is inherently strategic, which is, of course, correct. If the objective of air assets is not targeting a strategic center of gravity, it is not air power. It is an entirely different concept known as air support. And here Douhet has some uncomfortable words to say, and I quote, "Aerial means used by the Army and Navy to facilitate and integrate their own actions in their respective fields, no matter what those actions may be, are an integral part of the Army and Navy and must be considered as such." And even worse, quote, "By the phrase Army and Navy Auxiliary Aviation, I mean all the aerial means utilized by the Army and Navy to facilitate and integrate operations in the respective fields of action. If these auxiliary aerial means form an integral part of the Army and Navy, they must be 1. Included in the budgets of the Army and Navy, respectively, and 2. Placed absolutely under the direct command of the Army or the Navy, beginning with their organization and ending with their employment. The only body competent to decide upon the proper organization of this aerial auxiliary is the Army or Navy, as the case may be, for they are in possession of data necessary for determining the aerial weapons most suitable for furthering their respective actions." Now, lest you think Douhet is giving some sort of primacy to supporting the Army and Navy, perish the thought. Rather, he didn't care. These things weren't important. He frankly didn't care what the Army and Navy did with aircraft. What was important, solely important, were the imperatives of the independent Air Force, which was the exact wording used by the modern U.S. Air Force in demanding its independence. And what are the imperatives of the independent Air Force? First, it must be capable of winning the struggle for command of the air. And what is command of the air? Again, Douhet. Command of the air means to have the ability to fly against an enemy so as to injure him while he has been deprived of the power to do likewise. Second, it must be capable of exploiting the command of the air with forces capable of crushing the material and moral resistance of the enemy. But again, the first imperative was simply, in Douhet's mind, the prerequisite to the second, the ends. Again quoting, "When an independent Air Force meets only the first condition, the issue of the war will be decided by the struggle on land and sea." The independent Air Force also had the responsibility for defending against the second from enemy aircraft, which is why he focused so strongly on winning command of the air. It was a twofer. Once you had command of the air, you were impervious to air attack, while, at the same time, your enemy's strategic and political centers of gravity were completely helpless. It must never be forgotten that Douhet died in 1930. He was not a futurist, rather a realist of the now. His tactics and equipment prescriptions were entirely tied to the existing aviation capability of the early 1920s and what was foreseeable in the next few years. He was a fascist. He saw another war between Italy and the Western powers as inevitable, and he was writing for an Italian government to develop the means to fight that war. He saw no effective defense against air attack, and so discounted it, both air and ground, as to maintain the requisite forces to provide that defense would be economically prohibitive. But he did acknowledge that technology could change his theories. He said, if, thanks to aerial defense, we had to fear from the enemy aerial offenses only unimportant and not dangerous damage, I would be the first to uphold such a defense, even if it required all our national aerial resources. So we have two requirements. First, to win command of the air. Second, to quote former President Trump, bomb the shit out of them. And here we've run right into the problem with the application of air power. The first requirement is exceedingly technical, requiring amazing technology, highly trained specialists, from pilots to engineers to manufacturers to maintainers, and lots of money. The second requirement, the targeting of the strategic center of gravity, is entirely psychological. It is the art of air power. To know your enemy's society so exceedingly well that you can apply air power at precisely the right place and time to effect the destruction of, again, in the words of Douhet, the morale of the people. Douhet wasn't screwing around. He openly advocated for the use, or threatened use, of chemical weapons against civilian populations. But his seeming madness was humanitarian at its core. remembering that this was in the immediate aftermath of the incalculable slaughter of World War I that, by and large, left the civilian populations of the primary belligerents untouched. Douhet theorized that once the first requirement, command of the air, was achieved, that merely the threat of the second would be enough to cause the immediate surrender of whoever lost the initial air war. The capability to inflict the second was all that was required. It would not have been used, at least not much. Deterrence through air power in its infancy. Now, to return to the law of war, it doesn't take a military genius to see that Douhet's entire theory was the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and civilian targets with weapons of mass destruction. Now it's getting a little uncomfortable. The early air power advocates of the Army Air Corps, later the Army Air Force, and finally the United States Air Force, knew this fact and accepted it. As uncomfortable as this was, it was a necessary evil to protect the country. And they very early on knew to not speak of it. Precision was the watchword of the early Air Corps. When justifying their early bombers to Congress, they spoke of anti-ship scouting, precision bombing of industrial buildings, the much-publicized Mitchell bombing of Navy ships. Anything but the true purpose of what these bombers were actually for. The early internal writings show this duplicitousness, but they believed in the importance of air power, and they felt justified in acquiring it by any means necessary. It must be noted that bombing a warship is inherently antithetical to air power, but these demonstrations were purely political in nature, justifying the unjustifiable being part of the game. And this brings us to the second friction point of air power. The first requirement largely requires one type of aircraft, the tactical fighter. The second requirement requires a completely different type of aircraft, the strategic bomber. The Army Air Corps was torn initially on what to focus on. You had a fighter mafia and you had the bomber mafia, and both had their strong points. The fighter mafia could claim, with historical justification from World War I and more recent experiments in Spain, that any bomber trying to fly before command of the air had been achieved would be shot down before it got anywhere. Therefore, command of the air was primary, through pursuit, later called fighter aircraft, and the focus should be there. And technology in the early 30s supported that. But then big bad Boeing started cranking out some big bad bombers, and the baddest of them all was the B-17 Flying Fortress, which seemingly ended the debate. Fighters existed to carry machine guns into the air and shoot down enemy fighters. But what if the bomber had the machine guns? And there were hundreds of bombers, all supporting each other in giant formations. There would be no need for fighters. Command of the air could be temporary at the critical point. Shades of Julian Corbett and sea control versus command of the sea. And the bombers, quickly laying waste to the enemy's center of gravity, would bring an end to the war without the need for fighters. This is one of the reasons that World War II saw the B-17 fly from day one to the end of the war. The Army Air Corps bet heavy on bombers. But back to theory and doctrine. Command of the air is meaningless in and of itself. It must always facilitate another capability, whether that is strategic air power or ground and naval forces fighting to a more traditional operational and tactical objective. It has become dogmatic that command of the air is a prerequisite to any success on the battlefield. And yet, even after Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, you still have those who insist it is the first and only real priority. The dogma has overtaken the doctrine and theory. The origins of this can be traced to the absolute best case study of the triumphs and failures of air power, World War II, which we will cover next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.